Hello and welcome. I'm Fraser Nelson. I'm the editor of The Spectator, also a director of the Centre for Policy Studies. The CPS has long been one of Britain's most influential think tanks, but the work now has never been more important because the basic questions of how to revive an economy after a pandemic are of crucial importance. It's time to be creative, to think as broadly as we can, and that's why the CPS is running today's series. I'm delighted to be joined today by one of the very few people who actually knows exactly what it's like to resurrect an economy. George Osborne is a former Chancellor of the Exchequer, now Editor-in-Chief of the Evening Standard, from whose office he joins me now. George, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining us. Now, 10 years ago, a bit more than that, you became Chancellor. People said at the time that it was probably the worst possible time for a new Chancellor to take the job. But when you think of what Rishi Sunak's got to do now, do you think to yourself, thank God I'm not in his place?
Fraser, it's good to be here with you and great to be back on a CPS platform. No, look, I think there's part of you that relishes the challenge. You know, I mean, yes, in many ways, this isn't the situation that anyone would want to be Chancellor, but Rishi Sunak's got an incredibly important job where his decisions, you know, have a real material effect on the economic well-being of the country. And after all, that's why people go in politics to try and, you know, improve their society. So I think it's an incredibly interesting challenge, and I think he's got the added advantage, if you like, that no one's blaming him or blaming the government for having created this situation. You know, I remember, you know, one of the challenges I had, although of course we were new government and people had kicked out the Labour Party, there was a lot of anger, understandable anger, that the financial system had caused this crisis, the bankers had caused this crisis. And so there was a lot of bitterness, whereas I don't think he's dealing with that sort of same environment. I think there's a lot of understanding that it's a kind of act of nature. Of course, that will start to dissipate as people start to question the choices. But it feels like a slightly different political environment as a result.
But right now we're in one of these kind of economic roadrunner moments where the roadrunner's gone over the cliff, he's looking down, he hasn't quite fallen yet. I mean, we know that unemployment is about to surge by the end of the year, likely to go through 3 million. That would be quite something. Now, so I imagine as a former politician, former Chancellor, you recognize that it's fairly easy to be popular if you're being posing as the savior, if you're giving out lots of money. But over the next 3 or 4 months, he's going to have some incredibly difficult and unpopular decisions to take.
Yeah, I think that is broadly right. You know, it's quite easy being Chancellor if you're just handing out money. It's quite easy to be popular just handing out money. Much harder to raise revenue, much harder to take action to try and prevent, you know, much harder to deal with a situation where unemployment is rising and so on. You know, I think he and the Treasury officials around him have done a really remarkable job over the last 6 months and been very innovative. I mean, we're often very critical, or certainly members of the current government are very critical of the British civil service and, you know, that it's, you know, not futuristic enough and it's not accountable enough and so on. But, you know, if you look at what the Treasury has done, it has designed schemes like the furlough scheme and the bounce back loan schemes that really, you know, were unprecedented in scale and in scope. And that has got us through this initial phase of the crisis. But you're quite right that we're now entering, I think, a different phase. I mean, the health crisis is not over, but it's becoming increasingly apparent that some jobs will not be there for people to go back to. Certain businesses will not be there for people to go back to. This thing is lasting much longer than, you know, some people had hoped 6 months ago. And that is a sort of tougher phase of the crisis. I think there, you know, the job of the Chancellor and the job of the Prime Minister is to explain that to people, you know, and, you know, to you know, these are great, you know, Boris Johnson is a great communicator. He should be using his communication skills to talk people through what is going to happen on unemployment and what the government's response is going to be.
And when it comes to the government's response, there are many people whose jobs won't be there because basically of government policy. We've had the new rule of six. There are many people are following the government's instructions, and as a result, there are lots of businesses, especially in London, which aren't going to come back. Do you think there's a case for extending the furlough scheme for people who are employed in businesses that can't come back to work because government regulations basically make it impossible?
I think it's highly likely that the furloughs. Look, there's a big risk here, which is that you end the furlough scheme when you haven't ended the health crisis. We don't have a vaccine. We're all hoping there will be a vaccine. I'm actually quite optimistic you might get a vaccine perhaps sooner than people think. But nevertheless, the health crisis is continuing. There are ongoing restrictions, as you just mentioned, and new restrictions. And so into that environment, to just end the furlough scheme without any kind of thing to replace it is a gamble, frankly. Now, I've been very, very supportive of both the decision to introduce the furlough and the necessity of withdrawing the furlough, because I don't think it's actually fair or sensible to keep people at home in jobs that no longer exist when they really need to be, tragically looking for work or reskilling or whatever. It's not fair to those individuals ultimately, and it's certainly not good for the economy. But if it's the case at the end of October, which seems now pretty likely, that there are going to remain sectors that are closed down essentially because of government health regulation, then I think you have to look at our sector-specific furlough extensions, or something more akin to what you now see in continental European countries, of sort of wage subsidy schemes. So we're no longer paying people to stay at home, but we are paying perhaps people to work part-time, or we're paying people to be in the office and supporting their incomes, so that you don't have this, I know it's an overused word at the moment in British politics, but this cliff edge at the end of October. And I would be surprised if the Treasury wasn't looking at all of that, because otherwise it's a very big risk to see a big spike in unemployment when you haven't solved your health crisis. You might be more willing to take the spike in unemployment if you've got your vaccine, and then you have to let your economy undergo a transition to a sort of post-COVID economy, if you like. But when you're still battling the disease, that feels to me like a risk.
But would you say we're still battling the disease now? If you look at the number of people in hospital for COVID, it's down pretty much 90% from its peak. The ONS says that there are more people dying of summer flu now than dying of COVID. So how much of a health crisis do you think there is right now?
I think you have to accept that I'm not in the sort of libertarian camp, or the camp that says the government, or any government, can just sort of let this disease run rip. Because I just know too many people who've had the disease and either been extremely ill with it, or have sort of a friend of mine has long-term debilitating symptoms, having had this disease months ago. And of course, people have lost their lives, and it's no good saying, well, you would have died in 5 years' time. Yeah. That's not much of a consequence. So I am more in the camp that you have to take preventive measures. And ultimately, it's interesting, if you look at the economic figures, broadly speaking, countries that have been better in control of the second wave of this crisis, and look, I totally accept it's not as nearly as severe as it was in March or April, but nevertheless, countries that are more on top of it, the second wave, if that's what you call it, are doing better economically. So I think there is a link. Where I completely agree with you is that, we ultimately have to, until a vaccine's developed and deployed, we have to find ways to live with the vaccine, to function as a vaccine. We can't go back. We mustn't close the schools. Maybe it was a mistake closing them in the first place. We certainly mustn't close them again, closing the universities, closing businesses. We do need to find a way to function with the virus and run a degree of risk. But but nevertheless, measures like restricting social gatherings feel to me like perfectly reasonable restrictions on liberty in the face of the health challenge.
Right. Let's talk about one of the countries that has just come off the government's quarantine list, and that's Sweden. It's now got COVID levels which are lower than Norway and Denmark. It's now, I think it's fewer than half that of Belgium. Now, they took a very interesting economic argument. They were saying that we have to remember that economic crashes cost lives too. That when there's mass unemployment, there's always a link, a well-established link, between that and long-term disease and even deaths further down the line. The studies done over the recession after which you became Chancellor, looking at the health effects there. So Swedes were saying that you have to be careful that you don't take actions which might end up costing more lives than they save. Sweden has ended up with a recession only a third of our level. In fact, their public finance figures on Monday showed a surplus for August. Whereas I think this August, the British government is going to borrow more money in that month alone than it borrowed throughout the whole of the 1970s. So talk to us about the balancing act, because this isn't about lives versus money. Surely it's about lives versus lives. And as the editor-in-chief of London Evening Standard, you will see from your journey to work that this city is a shadow of its former self. There's a third of the traffic in the tube. There are businesses you'll be walking past that are closing that took years to build up. So we're not looking not just at economic damage here, but damage to people's economic livelihoods and damage to the ecosystem of the city here, for a city which does not really have much of a COVID problem to talk about.
Yeah, look, I think, I know you have taken a keen interest in what Sweden has done and written about it in interesting ways. I don't feel sort of hugely qualified to say that was like definitely a better path than the path that other countries took, and so I'm sure there'll be lessons learned of was the world too oppressive in the lockdown that it introduced in March, but in a way that's sort of now history. I'm absolutely with you that we've got to find that there are real damaging consequences to people's lives and their health and their mental health and their economic well-being from these restrictions, and therefore you need to find a way to better live with the disease. And I was on the tube the other day, earlier this week, and my carriage was completely empty at 9 in the morning. Now there is no necessity for that, and messages from them, and the Evening Standard has made this point. Let's send the message out clearly. Tube is safe, that public transport is safe because of the measures we've taken to limit numbers and socially distance on buses and so on. So I absolutely agree. You want to send a message that activity can return within these new health guidelines. I'm just saying that's the balance. I think it's also important to think we're not going. I think the framework that if you think mentally that we're all going back to the world of February 2020, that is not going to happen. This crisis, like all previous health crises in world history and indeed economic crises, will change our society and change the way we go about our activity. For some people, working like this remotely has been a huge blessing, and they've spent lots of time with their family and had a good time of it. And frankly, I've enjoyed much of it in that sense. But at the same time, it's been a real imposition. It's hugely damaged their economic prospects. Perhaps, they have not had the space at home that others have enjoyed. And so, working out a way to make the economy function where people do enjoy some of the sort of flexibility of working from home and this new technology, whilst at the same time not thinking that we can live like this as a society forever, I think is, part of what if you're running a city or you're running a business, you need to be thinking about in the future and finding a kind of new, more flexible, but not as digital as this way of functioning.
Thanks. We'll move to questions from our viewers in a bit. Anybody watching can submit some questions in the YouTube chat. But let's talk a bit about the recovery. We've seen today the ONS estimates 6.6% growth in July. Is your money on a V-shaped recovery, a U-shaped recovery, some other letter out there?
No, look, I've always been quite optimistic, actually, throughout this crisis, that the economy would come back quite quickly, not just here but elsewhere. And that's because, the damage It's very unfair, this crisis, because certain businesses, like you could have the best restaurant in Britain, right? And you could have the worst hand sanitizer manufacturer in Britain. And one has done really well, the hand sanitizer manufacturer. The best restaurant has done terribly. So it's been very unfair and a bit random in its impact. But broadly speaking, the damage being done to the economy is not as great as was done in 2008-9, just before I became Chancellor, because there, you know, the credit channels of the economy were blown up, and, you know, recovery from financial crisis in any part of human history has always taken a long time. I've always, therefore, been much more, this is going to be a sort of V-shaped, and the ONS numbers today suggest that, but that it's going to have some very particular and unfair and harsh consequences for individuals and businesses through no fault of their own.
Right. Now, when you were Chancellor, you were very worried about the market's ability to lend money. I remember at the time, Italy was going through a debt crisis. So you were able to say to the country, look, we have to balance the books. We have to get our debt in order, because if we don't, then the markets are going to rack up for interest rates. We're going to lead to instability, and we'll end up down the same spiral that Italy was then caught in. I put it to you that that was an incorrect assessment of the bond market, that one of the big surprises to you and to everybody over the last 10 years is just how much markets are willing to lend to governments that have got no real credible plan to balance the books. And right now, the government has never borrowed more, and yet they're paying, what, 0.2% interest rate? That's a negative real interest rate. So are we in a new era where governments can simply borrow money? The markets are anxious to lend money to governments, and you simply don't need to balance your books in the way that you once thought was necessary.
Well, I certainly think it's a different situation. I mean, in 2010, there was a very real prospect of a fiscal crisis in the UK. You know, we were borrowing large sums of money. There was not, you know, there was the constitutional innovation that we had a hung parliament and not, you know, a government that people weren't sure was going to last. And there were a whole series of near neighbours of ours who were facing funding crises. Greece, Ireland on our doorstep, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and so on. And I, you know, it was not a risk that I was prepared to run, that Britain would find itself in a financial crisis. And by the way, the austerity would have been very much more severe as it was in those countries. So, you know, I think we took sensible steps. We explained them clearly to people. We got elected on that program, and we delivered the program. I think there's got to, you know, I would say today, you know, the monetary policy has evolved. It's even looser than it was back then. You know, there is certainly an appetite in the markets there for government securities like gilts. But ultimately, you know, there is a law of gravity which says that countries need to show investors that they have a credible plan. Doesn't have to be today, doesn't have to be tomorrow, but in the future for living within their means. And that if you don't have that, you ultimately will potentially face a crisis or face higher borrowing rates.
Right, but that was your argument when you were... That was your argument when you were Chancellor, but it seems to me as if the financial environment has simply changed now. I mean, when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, he was saying that he thinks in retrospect austerity was a mistake. And I guess by what he meant by that was that the markets have shown they were actually willing to lend a lot more than governments thought. So the coalition government might have inflicted a lot of financial pain that wasn't strictly necessary, simply because the market conditions were not quite as sharp as you thought.
Well, I'm just not sure. I don't agree, because I think that was the situation in 2010, 11, 12, 13. And, you know, there were very near neighbours of ours. Look at what happened in Ireland, right? Look what happened in Iceland. You know, there were countries on our doorstep who faced near total economic collapse because they lost the confidence internationally of people who lend money to governments and institutions lend money to governments. And I would say today that it is a risk for the UK and indeed other countries to assume that you can just borrow forever and have no regard for your deficit and basically don't even attempt to raise in taxation what you're spending. We have credibility as a country. I would argue, by the way, we precisely did fix the roof in order to endure this unpredicted storm, so that Britain could borrow and has credibility and does so at a low cost. But you then have to, once the storm passed, start to repair again. Otherwise, you could go into the next crisis in a very poor shape. And that I know that that's clearly also the thinking of the Treasurer and the Chancellor, because that is what he's saying and what the Treasury is communicating.
Right, the Treasury's yeah, and the conversation is now moving on to what taxes need to be raised to balance the books in the way that you suggest. And one of the prime candidates, it seems, for that is corporation tax. So do you think, in retrospect, that Britain could, if it is time for corporation tax, up quite a few points? And when you were Chancellor, you said, okay, let's send a message. We want to have the lowest corporation tax of any G20 country. But realistically, we need the money now. The Tory manifesto has ruled out any increases in VAT and income tax. So do you think it's the right thing to do now to increase corporation tax, capital gains tax?
Look, I think you need, first of all, I'm not anything about the beginning to repair the fiscal situation is about post the health crisis. So I'm not talking about here and now. And I think there are important other components of the economic policy. I think monetary policy needs to stay very loose, and the Bank of England is doing that, but needs to keep its foot on the floor for that.
Just on that, do you think it's time for more quantitative easing? Because right now, as you know, the government's borrowed a lot of money, but the Bank of England has printed as much as the government's borrowed. Yeah. So do you think there should be another, 200 billion quantitative easing?
No, I think actually the Bank of England and other central banks have proved rather innovative at yield curve control and essentially buying. It's a form of monetary financing. They don't like to talk about it like that. But, monetary policy has evolved. The Federal Reserve has made some big moves recently on how it thinks about its inflation target and how it targets employment. And, I think that kind of innovation is a good thing to be thinking about. So monetary policy is really important. I always thought that during the crisis. In fact, one of my big criticisms of the European Central Bank during the Euro crisis was that it was not being loose enough. And one of the big changes now is that the Eurozone has got its act together during this crisis, not in the initial weeks where there was, Italy versus Germany, but in fact, they've taken a big further step towards a kind of monetary union in this crisis. So loose monetary policy, employment we've talked about, I would be, very focused on jobs and working out how to avoid the cliff edge on the furlough. But then though, to your final point on sort of, I think you need to start to set out a credible fiscal plan over many years to try and return the budget towards balance and get the deficit down, which is going to be very, very high. At the same time, and I tried to do this 10 years ago, you have to create an environment that says Britain's the go-to place to invest, the go-to place to set up a business, the go-to place when you've got so many choices in the world to go and hire people. And that is a kind of intangible thing. But part of the ingredients of it are low business taxes. I wanted to send a message that the UK had the lowest business tax rate of anywhere in the G20. I had to deal with the incredibly unpopular decision to cut the 50p rate of income tax that Labour had just introduced a month before the general election.
You wanted to make it 40%, didn't you?
Well, I wanted to make it 40% and introduce 2 new council tax bands, which I think would have been a better solution.
But a certain mayor of London protested, didn't he?
Well, I think there was also a certain prime minister
who backed it anyway.
But you've got to send those signals, and for the UK, an open trading economy, having a competitive business tax environment is really important. Other things go with it. You want to be a welcoming home to talented people from around the world. You probably shouldn't be going around, breaking your treaty obligations. There are all sorts of things you can do to create a sense that this is a reliable enterprise economy. And those ingredients, Rishi Sunak is ideally, I think, equipped to deliver this as a chancellor because that is his background and his thinking and so on. But that you need to kind of fire up the enterprise spirits, and it's difficult because the Treasury, there's not like one lever sitting on the Chancellor's desk, which is like, enterprise culture. It's a whole mixture. It's an ecosystem of things. But for me, Britain, jacking up the business tax rate, what message does that send to business around the world?
Right. This brings us on to a question here from YouTube saying, in 18 months' time, we could be recovering from the pandemic with debts way in excess of 100% of GDP, sterling worth less than it is now, trade tariffs with our largest trading partner, massive quantitative easing. Do you think increased inflation is inevitable?
I don't think it's inevitable. I think central banks have been trying to stimulate inflation for many years, but the deflationary sources are still very powerful in the world, driven by technology, driven by continuing globalization, despite the trade war with China and the like. So those and of course the pandemic. So there are kind of very powerful deflationary forces, and I don't think that's I don't think inflation should be top of the central bank concerns at the moment.
Right. Now, when it comes to, you're talking earlier on about encouraging business and confidence, are there taxes that you would cut now to try to encourage that? Do you think we're going to have to go through a period of cutting taxes to get economy moving again, and in other words, taking in more deficit before we start to raise taxes? Because I get that you're not keen on a corporation tax, but we know politically that what does that leave? Capital gains tax. There's hardly anything else. So if you're going to say, well, in that case, presumably you don't propose more austerity. I don't know, perhaps you do, but I'm not quite clear what you would do to square the circle. Would you think there's a case now for cutting taxes to get the economy moving and hoping that growth will actually close that gap?
Well, I've never been a kind of supply side tax cutter, nor was Geoffrey Howe in his famous 1981 budget and Margaret Thatcher. So, Britain does not have the sort of Ronald Reagan world reserve currency to fall back on that the dollar represents. So, I've always been more fiscally conservative than that. I think there are tax cuts that can send important signals about enterprise, even in a situation where you're trying to close a funding gap. But if you look at what I did, I increased VAT. I took actions on things like pensions and the like to try and make the tax burden fall more on richer people, which, you look at the IFS and everything they did, that is their conclusion. But I also tried to limit the tax rises and worked on roughly a formula of 80% spending restraint to 20% tax rises. Now, there's nothing holy about that principle, but broadly speaking, higher taxes will impair economic growth, and will and there's also a sort of basic law of British politics, which is that no government, Conservative or Labour or coalition, has really managed to get the tax burden much higher than 39% of the national income. So if you want to run a public expenditure of 45% of national income, you have got a real problem. And unless you can completely change the British public's opinion about tax rises, which is generally like, yeah, of course, tax my neighbour, but not me, then you're going to have to look at spending restraint.
Right. So you're thinking of it, it's pretty difficult for the British government, simply because of the country and economy we are, of giving tax revenues much in excess of 35% of GDP.
39%.
39%, sorry, yeah. And
yeah.
So that means, would you propose getting spending back down to 40%?
Well, look, I reduced spending as a share of national income from around 46%, which I found, to 40% by the time I left. A big reduction. Now, part of that was cyclical, but it's also much more sustainable. The truth is, there are not out there the tax rises that are publicly acceptable that will raise significant sums of money. I'm not saying you can't do things at the margins. Indeed, I increased capital gains tax in my first budget and reduced it towards the end of my time as Chancellor. But capital gains tax, last time I checked, raises about 4 billion out of the 900 billion that the government needs. So unless you're prepared to have substantially higher levels of income tax, VAT, national insurance, and I don't hear anyone arguing for those things, including the Labour Party, you have to end up with public expenditure being in line with your tax revenues or broadly in line. And you can borrow to get there because we've been through a crisis. But ultimately, that's the sort of long-term sustainable position for the UK. And by the way, 40% of a growing economy on public expenditure is a lot. There's a lot you can do with that money. And there's no reason why your government can't spend that money to address social injustice and improve the performance of the economy and the infrastructure of the country and educate our children. And it's a lot of £900 billion. It's a lot of money.
Right. So you're saying, just to be clear then, that the only practical route out of this is some expenditure reform to get spending back down to 40% of GDP. That's the only practical solution.
I think that is where we'll end up. Now, I've known Boris Johnson for 25 years. He won't want to set it out like that because it's not really his. That is what, I see him, or indeed, if it was a Starmer government, that is what they will end up delivering. Now, I took the view back in 2010, and David Cameron did, that it's better to try and explain to the country what you're doing. Austerity, when it was introduced or reintroduced into the sort of British political language, was not a kind of bad word. It was an attempt it was used at the time by me and others to explain that this is a necessary program of adjustment. We're going to try and do it fairly. And I think it's important to remember that at the time we carried the country with us. The public supported the economic policies of the Conservative Chancellor at the time, and we got, of course, re-elected on the economy. So, I think it's better to be upfront with people and communicate clearly with people. In fact, my whole general sort of advice throughout this crisis and going forward is explain. People are perfectly aware there's a virus and it needs to be controlled, and they're perfectly aware of the impact on the economy, perfectly aware that it's costing the country money that will have to be repaid in the future. And if you go around telling people there are going to be no public expenditure cuts, no tax rises, they just don't believe you, with good reason. So, and as a result, will probably defer spending or carry on saving or be very cautious in their own behavior because they know that they're not being, leveled with by the politicians. If the politicians do explain things to them, they actually, and there's the confidence of a longer term plan, then that gives you the groundwork on which someone says, yeah, maybe I will now start a business. Maybe I will hire another employee. Maybe I'll take that risk. Sure. I've got
but you know what the Conservative Party is like, though. I mean, it's all very well saying that you want spending to be 40% of GDP, but to convert that to a politician's choice, that means, do you drop HS2? I bet you wouldn't. Do you cut international aid? I bet you wouldn't. I suspect if I were to ask you what spending you would cut to reach this 40% you think is optimal, even now as a recovering politician, you probably couldn't answer.
Well, I think, look, a lot of it is about the individual acts of big infrastructure like HS2 can seem very expensive. But when you set them aside, like the annual housing benefit budget, they're not that expensive. So I'm a huge believer in these major acts of infrastructure, which, by the way, take decades to get off the ground and get working and get planning for. Crossrail, which, I gave the go-ahead to in 2010, sadly is still not working 10 years later, and was first announced by Cecil Parkinson at the 1988 Conservative Party conference. So these things, the one thing we mustn't do is sort of stop some of these big long-term infrastructure programs like HS2, like Northern Powerhouse Rail, like Crossrail 2 in London, like the third runway at Heathrow, by the way. Those things take years and years to, and I don't think the mistake is to be blown off course by recessions. If anything, you should use them as an excuse to sort of turbocharge the planning. So therefore, where do the bulk of your public expenditure savings, and I'm not fetishizing, by the way, 40%. I'm just saying you don't need to broadly return public expenditure into line with taxation, is you have to kind of hold down the growth of departments. That's largely what we did, tried to contain costs, make some difficult decisions on entitlements, on welfare. We took child benefit away from the richest 20% of the population. By the way, probably the thing we asked students to make a bigger contribution to their university funding. Those two things, by the way, were probably the most controversial things I did, and they affected the richest half of the population. So, I was well aware that I was getting many more BBC reports on child benefit than I ever got on what we were doing on tax credits, for example. So, that's the truth, is you have to make some decisions on welfare and entitlements. You have to be tough about that. You have to be tough about the pension age, which I was. You have to then try and constrain the growth of it's hard work.
And maybe time to stop bribing pensioners.
Ultimately, good housekeeping,
But what about getting rid of the treble lock, stop bribing pensioners? Every time the Tories panic, they offer more money to pensioners. I mean, maybe it's time to break that cycle.
Well, I was the one who took away gave to the BBC the choice around the free TV licenses. So I think, entitlements that go to the richer part of the population become increasingly difficult to justify when, the country has run out of money.
Now, there's a question here from Alice Denby. What's the right balance between safeguarding the health of older people and the COVID and protecting young people from the economic harm of lockdown? I mean, you will see, I imagine in an office of yours, there are far fewer younger people around. I mean, younger people are the least likely to be affected by the virus, but the most likely to be hurt by lockdown. They're quite unlikely to vote Conservative as well. And it seems to me as if in the last 2 weeks, we've had the government effectively blaming younger people for putting the virus around. We've had a very stern language from the health secretary saying that don't kill your granny. It seems yet again as if the young people's suspicion of the Tory party is reciprocated, and that there could be some making up to do with the generation which has had their exams scrambled, the university replaced by digital simulacrum, has had, I think, internships are down by 40%, the chance to learn from others in an office is gone. What can be done to help the young who've been hit so badly by lockdown?
Well, first thing I'd say is it's a disaster for the Conservative Party to think of itself as the party of older people. And certainly when I was involved in running the Conservative Party, we made huge efforts to increase our support amongst younger people and indeed amongst metropolitan types, which I know is now very unfashionable, but in this city in London, we ended up getting as many votes as the Labour Party. So I just sort of made that political observation. Of course, there's been a sort of what feels like a great generational injustice in that the virus disproportionately affects older people, but not exclusively. And younger people have paid for it in their lack of loss of education or employment. The government, of course, needs to try and address that because it's also good for the future health of the economy and the society. I mean, I think that under no circumstances should the schools be allowed to close again, right? I think I can see why the decision was taken in the middle of fears in March that healthcare systems would be overwhelmed, as they were in Northern Italy, but that the NHS is not going to be overwhelmed by a second wave. And therefore, we've got to keep the schools and universities open. I've been talking earlier about what you can do to try and keep people in work and what you can do to try and create an environment in which people have jobs. I think one thing that will come out of this, Fraser, one thing that the whole thing has thrown up is a real apartheid in the sort of digital economy. There are here, you and I are talking on good internet connections, and we have access to IT at home and in our offices. Many children, including my own daughter, had excellent online teaching from their school throughout the crisis.
Private school, you mean,
yeah. And yet there were millions of children whose schools were not able to provide, for whatever reason, digital learning. There were people who didn't have access to good internet connections, didn't have access to a computer, were sharing a single computer amongst a family of 5 or 6 people, some working, some supposed to be learning. That to me feels like a huge new agenda, that whatever is going to happen in the future, we know there's going to be more of this. And if you want to address both generational injustice and sort of economic injustice, economic inequality, a big push in the digital space would feel to me like an agenda that I haven't yet heard either major political party talking about, but is pretty self-evident from what we've experienced over the last 6 months.
A question now from Ronald Lehman. The delayed return of commuters to London has hit Metro, the Evening Standard and City AM. What's your current thinking to overcome the devastating effects of your ability to distribute copies. How does a paper like the Evening Standard get out of a situation where advertising is hit very hard, commuters are down by 2/3? Where does that leave the Standard?
Yeah, no, look, it's been a huge, I mean, it's been a kind of, it's a sort of cruel double-edged sword for the Evening Standard and other newspapers. It's the biggest story of my life. So, you know, it's an incredible thing to be part of if you're running a media organization and people really want information. But at the same time, it's devastated advertising. And in the case of, you know, the Evening Standard and others like Metro, of course, the distribution mechanisms on the tubes were, you know, basically shut down. So what we did in the middle of the crisis, and I was the editor right up until the beginning of the summer, you know, we switched distribution so that we were hand delivering the newspapers through 500,000 doors in London. And of course, putting a huge effort into our online website. And look, to be honest, also, we had generous owners of this newspaper who stumped up the cash when it was needed. So, you know, that's how we got through the crisis. But it is, you know, it's one of the sort of things about this crisis. And by the way, there are many crises that could have worked in different ways, but this one feels like it's accelerated changes that were already happening in our society. The growth of the online economy, the decline of the high street, the challenge for the newspaper industry. You know, all those things feel like they've been turbocharged over the last 6 months.
Right. So where does this leave a free newspaper? Has that business model just simply collapsed?
No, I don't think it has. But we have to be smarter about sponsorship and advertising, and work harder to raise it. I mean, there's you know, you and the team at The Spectator have done a great job at that magazine and building the funding model for it. There is a distinction in my mind between a product like The Spectator or indeed the Financial Times, you know, which is aimed at, I don't know how many readers you've got now, but, you know, a group of people who are prepared to pay a subscription, and a mass market newspaper. So the Evening Standard, you know, before the crisis was producing 900,000 copies a day, you know, or the Sun or the Daily Mail. No one I've seen anywhere in the world has been able to crack the mass media challenge for a very large population who, you know, frankly, I don't think are necessarily willing to pay a subscription. Now, it's not that there's an absence of revenues out there, because, you know, you might have noticed two companies called Facebook and Google who have become among the world's largest companies off the back of digital advertising, on digital advertising around information and data and news about the world. So that, you know, it is there. The moment is killing the publishers and enabling the digital platforms. And you know, people talk about tax. To me, it's more about we've got to fix that. And there's a quite interesting experiment going on in Australia at the moment, a standoff between the digital platforms and the kind of publishers, if you like, of the information that people want to see online.
Okay. Well, let's move now to one of your other jobs in finance. The City of London has got some major challenges right now. It's got Brexit coming up. What do you think can be done to ensure its success after the 31st of December? That's a question from Richard Hosking.
Yeah, look, I mean, as you well know, I am not was not and I'm not a fan of Brexit.
Hasn't been as bad as you thought, though, has it? I mean, you were talking all sorts of things. Like, I mean, the scenarios haven't really come to pass.
We can have we'll need another hour for this.
Yes, you're right. Okay, let's.
I don't think the rest of the world would say Britain's done really well in the last 4 years. But, you know, the point I would make is this, that if we now, through an act of self-harm, have no ongoing trade relationship with Germany and France and, you know, the Netherlands.
You mean WTO, you mean?
Yeah, by leaving with, you know, the EU economic sphere with no deal, then, you know, good luck to us. But, you know, that is doubling down on what is already a very difficult economic situation for the UK because of the coronavirus and indeed for other countries. And it doesn't, you know, we don't need to be doing that, right? of course, try and negotiate a good deal for the UK. But if really the issue left is, how many fish we can catch, and whether Downing Street can build a homegrown Google by pouring public money into tech, then I don't think that's worth blowing up our trading relationship with our near neighbours. Frankly, it doesn't. I'm not part of those negotiations, but that's what I read seems to be the sticking points. One of my first political jobs was the special advisor at the Ministry of Agriculture, and even then, and this is the cost of enforcing the fishing regime was more expensive than the industry itself raised. And I'm not saying that there aren't fishing communities that need to be helped and are helped, but this is not our most important industry, and we've got to be realistic about Britain's future. And we've got to be realistic that there has been a long. Most of the Conservative governments that I either was part of or followed when I was a child were working to reduce state intervention in industry, working to reduce Whitehall's belief that it can pick winners. When I was Chancellor, even under the EU state aid regime, I was having to resist, crazy schemes to try and keep going businesses that very sadly had clearly gone bust and were never going to come back.
Right, this takes us to a question from John Moulton, who's involved with the Centre for Policy Studies, also one of Britain's most successful venture capitalists. He's talking about what you were saying earlier about HS2 and a third runway. His point is, capital expenditure on bad projects will cause economic decline, not growth. He's a guy who doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yeah, well, it's true, except I'm not sure we agree on what those bad projects are. I dug up, when we were looking at Crossrail and HS2 in the Treasury, I dug up the Treasury advice on the M25. And sure enough, the Treasury was completely against the M25. It was like a waste of money. It was much better to spend money on mini roundabouts in Hemel Hempstead, basically, was the Treasury's view. That would be, can you imagine now the southeast of England without the M25? The Channel Tunnel, bitterly opposed by High Speed 1, right, through Kent. There is a High Speed 1, that's why it's called High Speed 2. High Speed 1 through Kent, has not only greatly sped up journeys to the continent, but actually created enormous growth through Kent.
You're right. All those things are true, but I'm just struck that this tends to be the standard defence for HS2. All people oppose the M25. I mean, when you actually look at the cost-benefit analysis, which is what John Moulton's talking about, I mean, a venture capitalist like him will look at the possible returns. Almost everybody who's looked at HS2 thinks there's no way the taxpayer is going to get a return. And here we are, you're sitting in an emptying city, and you're talking about people working from home. Doesn't that give you pause?
Well, if you travel on the West Coast Main Line, it's completely packed, pre-crisis and will be post-crisis. And the point about these very large infrastructure projects is that they take decades to deliver. So if we don't take the decision now, then we will not be providing the infrastructure in 20, 30 years' time. And there's a reason why the state needs to do it, precisely because, for very good commercial reasons, the John Boltons of this world and the venture capitalists and will not undertake the risk of big transformative infrastructure because it is very complicated, very politically controversial. Governments can change their minds, and so it's extremely difficult to fund outside of the public sector, but it is transformational. And if you're telling me that being able to travel from Manchester to London in an hour is not going to change the economic geography of our country, then I just don't believe it.
Okay. Well, we've got
actually been the revival of northern cities.
Right. We've got a final question from YouTube. With a possible no-deal Brexit, the government flouting international law, renewed lockdown restrictions, and rumours of tax hikes, if you're an investor, what reason would you have to put your money into Britain?
Well, Britain has enormous advantages still of being, one of the most competitive, one of the most flexible labour markets in the world, one of the most pro-business environments, one of the places where you can rely on the rule of law, where there is not sort of, nationalism in the way that judiciary operates. All of those things are huge advantages built up by governments over many, many decades. And, you know, it's Boris Johnson as Mayor of London built on that success and made London an even more successful place to invest. So, you know, he knows what needs to be done. And I have reasonable confidence he will do it. Because, you know, the thing about Boris is it normally takes a crisis for him to get into gear.
All right. But you can certainly see why Rishi Sunak's in such a problem. I mean, you're just advocating all of this expenditure. You're also advocating spending reform. You're not a great key advocate of the tax rises, especially corporation tax and capital gains tax. I'm not entirely clear what you would actually do in this situation right now.
Well, then I apologize if I haven't made myself clear, but you've also seen how I've done it in the past, right? I inherited a situation which was a mess, and I did two things. I set out a plan to get the public finances into balance, largely driven by constraining spending, but also some key tax rises like VAT, which were very efficient at raising revenue for things like the health service. And then second, fire up the enterprise spirits of the economy by cutting the headline business tax and by investing in the big infrastructure like Crossrail that are going to make it possible for businesses to grow and succeed in the future. The one thing I would add now is that digital dimension, which I think has been very exposed by the crisis, and make that part of my social justice campaign. But that is you know, I have no reason to believe that the formula that gave Britain the fastest recovery from the global financial crisis of any major economy wouldn't broadly work again this time around.
Okay, so we have our spending review coming up in a few months. So I'm imagining you think that spending review would start to give hints of restraining expenditure in the longer term to get back, I don't know, in 4 or 5 years' time to the sort of the 40% zone that you're talking about.
Well, look, we're still, remember, I became Chancellor 2 years after the crisis, the depth, or a year and a half after the depth of the crisis. And we're still in the crisis now. So this is, you know, a plan for a longer period, not necessarily 5 years, but, you know, maybe 6, 7 years. But you do need to start to have, you know, what we called a long-term economic plan. You need to kind of give people an indication of where you're going as a country, that you're fixing some problems, you're investing in the future, you're taking the big decisions on infrastructure that people haven't been prepared to take. You know, those sorts of things. And, you know, I know, of course, lots of the people in this Conservative government, lots of them are friends, former colleagues of mine. You know, I've got every confidence they can do it. But, you know, it all pays, and it all starts with leveling with the public about the real situation, which they themselves are well aware of, and then having the courage to address it.
And that real situation right now is what? That we're running massive deficits, and that's okay for the time being, but there will come a law of gravity, there will come a reckoning, and let's not pretend that's not going to be a very difficult period.
The very reason we have we build up credibility and fix the roof when the sun is shining is precisely so we can weather storms like this, you know, but you then owe it to the next generation to do the repair work as the storm passes.
Right. And now that you're not a politician anymore, would you be able to look back and say what your biggest mistake was when you were Chancellor?
Well, I think, there are two things which I regret. Well, there are many things I might regret, but the two, you know, which I would sort of do differently this time around, I was not quick enough to try and fix the ailing Royal Bank of Scotland, which was the lender to half of the small businesses in the country when I became Chancellor, and basically needed to be sort of broken up into a good bank, bad bank. We did eventually do that in 2013, but we were not quick enough clearing the kind of credit channels. I think there's a kind of bigger question actually, which applies now with a lot of the business loans that have been made during the crisis, of whether there should have been a much bigger act of debt forgiveness in that period, and asking creditors to take a haircut. And that might have cleared the credit channel sooner. I think the second thing, which was enormously frustrating, and I've alluded to again now, you know, the sort of digital infrastructure. We went through endless meetings and efforts and whatever to speed up the rollout of things like broadband. And, you know, just constantly it didn't quite work as we hoped. And there were disastrous attempts internationally to do big government schemes. There was one in Australia that went badly wrong. So it's not like that was the solution, and I'm not sure I have the answer today. All I know is that I'd be putting my very best people on it.
Right. Also, you introduced the national living wage, which is mutated now into a far bigger figure than you originally envisaged. Do you think it's a little bit too high now? And now that there's so many jobs on the line, do you think it might be so high that it might now threaten the chances of getting employment back to where we need it to be?
No, I think, look, I think that was a very important step in making sure that the lowest pay, the work paid. One of the things that we did, which was of course very controversial, was reform welfare. But that created a jobs revolution. It created close to full employment, because we created real incentives for people to be in work. One of the things I would say, I want to see more of from my Conservative government, as a member of the Conservative Party still, where is the education reform? It's there is no plan for education reform. Where's the talk of health reform? I mean, surely this crisis has shown up both the strengths, but also some of the weaknesses of the NHS. Where is the big plan for welfare reform? It's always entirely gone. Where's the big program for economic reform? I mean, where's the ambition? They've got a good majority. Although there's now a credible leader of the opposition, he hasn't got a credible team. So use the opportunity to do some things and use the crisis. As the phrase goes, never waste a good crisis, and use the crisis to lay the foundations of a stronger, better country.
And Keir Starmer seems to be presenting himself as a competent figure. That seems to be his style. Do you think right now, over the last few months, have given the government a reputation for incompetence, and this might become the Tory weak spot? It certainly seems that Keir Starmer thinks that. Do you think this is becoming an issue, that all of these U-turns, all of the changing advice is beginning to form a bit of a pattern in the mind of voters?
No, I mean, I worked for loads of leaders of the opposition. Most of them didn't become prime minister. I only worked for one who became prime minister. Keir Starmer has cleared a hurdle that, William Hague and Michael Howard and Ian Duncan Smith and Neil Kinnock and Ed Miliband and let alone Jeremy Corbyn were never able to clear, which is, he looks like an alternative party. He looks like he could do the job tonight. That is a huge advantage for an opposition leader. And I was one of the longest serving shadow chancellors in British history under two leaders. I know what a prize that is for an opposition, but it's not enough. So the Tory party does have a big challenge with Starmer, but Starmer has not yet, to my mind, established a sort of raison d'etre for the Labour Party or built a very strong, credible shadow cabinet. So, these U-turns and the thing, the U-turns are fine. Things like they're introducing the rule of six. That's perfectly reasonable. Explain to the public why you're doing this, and circumstances are changing. It's more there is going to be obviously there is a big economic fallout from this. People want confidence that the government knows what it's doing. They want people at the top to have a clear vision of what they're trying to do and competence in executing it. And if they don't, quite rightly, in a democratic system, you get punished by it. And particularly when there's, you don't have Jeremy Corbyn as your alternative, but you have Sir Keir Starmer, QC.
Well, you say Sir Keir Starmer looks like he could do the job tonight. Can you see yourself doing a job in government again? Come back as an elder statesman? I don't know. What's your position on this? You must get asked.
I don't feel that much elder. I think. Of course, I gave most of my adult life to politics and public service, and I'm here still involved with a newspaper, which is a form of public service. I'm of course really interested in my country and its future. But am I kind of chomping at the bit to be, get the call? Not at the moment, no.
Okay, not ruling it out. Very politician's answer. George Osborne, thank you so much for joining us. And also please remember to follow the CPS think tank on Twitter, or sign up to the newsletter for more events like this and to find out about the policy work. We're going to have our next panel now at 11:35 on the role of housing on the recovery, supported by Lloyds Bank, which does feature a load more of the country's leading policy experts. Also at 1:45, we're going to have another former Chancellor, Sajid Javid, interviewed by the CPS's director, Robert Colvile. So thank you very much for joining us. Thanks again, George Osborne, and do enjoy the rest of the program.
Thanks, Fraser.